Millionaire attends funeral to pay respects, then stops cold at seeing his black ex-wife. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Jonathan Stone was sitting in the back of his Bentley, adjusting his black tie. He was at the funeral home parking lot, and many fancy cars were parked around him. As the CEO of Stone Enterprises, Jonathan had to attend the funeral of Richard Wilson, a board member. But today felt different. He just wanted to go in, say goodbye, and leave. He told himself that. At 45, Jonathan had become good at going to events quickly. His job was very important, and he didn't want to waste too much time at funerals. The autumn wind blew and leaves flew across the parking lot as Jonathan got out of his car. Some people at the funeral nodded at him, and he smiled back in a polite way. When Jonathan walked into the funeral home, there were lots of people dressed in black. They were talking quietly, and the sound made the place feel calm. Jonathan wrote his name in the guest book and walked into the big room where Richard's open casket was. That's when he saw her. Standing near the flowers was Victoria. She was the woman Jonathan had married when he was younger, right after college. They had been married for only 2 years before she left him. She said she couldn't handle his long work hours and cold attitude. Now, 15 years later, she looked different, but still the same. She wore a simple black dress, and her dark skin shone in the soft light. Her hair was shorter now, styled nicely around her face. But what shocked Jonathan the most was the boy standing next to Victoria. The boy was around 14 years old, with light brown skin and the same facial features that Jonathan saw in the mirror every day. The way the boy stood with his shoulders back and a slight frown while looking at his phone was just like Jonathan when he was younger. It was as if Jonathan was looking at a picture of himself from the past. Jonathan whispered to himself, "This can't be real." He couldn't believe it. The boy was 14 and Victoria had left him 15 years ago. How could this be? As he stood there, Jonathan started feeling dizzy. He grabbed the back of a chair to stay standing. A few people looked at him with concern, but Jonathan didn't notice them. His eyes stayed on the boy. The boy looked up and saw Jonathan staring at him. They locked eyes, and the boy's expression changed from boredom to curiosity. The boy whispered something to Victoria, and she quickly grabbed his arm and tried to leave. She was scared. Jonathan called out louder than he meant to, "Victoria!" Some people looked over at him, but Victoria was already pulling her son away. The boy looked back at Jonathan, his face full of confusion. Jonathan's heart raced. He had to know what was going on. Jonathan rushed through the crowd, bumping into people. But by the time he reached the side door, Victoria's car was already speeding away. Jonathan watched the car disappear down the road, his mind racing. He had spent so many years telling himself he was better off without Victoria. He worked hard and became a successful businessman. But now, after seeing the boy, everything felt different. Jonathan took out his phone, his hands shaking. "Janet," he said when his assistant picked up the phone, "find out everything you can about Victoria Hale. Her address, where she works, the boys' school, everything." He hung up and walked back to his car, his thoughts racing. He couldn't believe it. He had a son, and Victoria had never told him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was not going to let this secret stay hidden. Jonathan started the car and dialed his lawyer. "I need to know my legal options," he said. "Find out everything about Victoria Hale." As Jonathan drove away from the funeral home, he was already planning his next steps. He had the right to know his son, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. Back at their apartment, Victoria was still shaking. Ethan, her son, walked in and dropped his jacket on the couch. "Mom, who was that man at the funeral? The one who called your name?" he asked. "And why did we leave so fast?" Victoria sat down in the kitchen, her heart racing. She knew this day would come. Every time she saw Jonathan in the news or when Ethan made that look on his face that reminded her of Jonathan, she knew this day would come. Sit down, honey, she said softly. There's something I need to tell you. Ethan sat down, looking serious. He looked so much like Jonathan, it made Victoria feel sad. She took a deep breath. That man at the funeral was Jonathan Stone. He's your father. Ethan's eyes grew wide. My father? But you said he died before I was born. Victoria's voice was shaky as she whispered, I lied. I lied. I lied to protect us both. Just then the phone rang and Victoria jumped. She checked the number and froze. It was her old law firm, the one she worked at during her marriage to Jonathan. Hello? Victoria said, her voice trembling. Victoria, it's David Payton. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but Jonathan Stone just hired our firm. He's looking into his parental rights. Victoria couldn't believe it. How did he find out so fast? She asked. David answered, You know Jonathan. He doesn't waste time. He's already filed for an emergency hearing in his favor. Victoria felt like her legs were giving out and she sat back down in the chair. Meanwhile, Ethan was on his phone, looking up Jonathan Stone. Mom, he said, his voice full of shock, Jonathan Stone is a huge deal. He's the CEO of Stone Enterprises. He's worth over $500 million. Victoria sat on the bed beside Ethan. She felt so sad. Jonathan Stone isn't just your father, honey, she said. He's the man who made me choose between my career and our marriage. He worked all the time and missed everything. He didn't care about anything but work. Ethan's voice cracked as he asked, So you just left without telling him about me? Victoria nodded. I did what I thought was best at the time. I wanted you to have a normal life, not to be caught up in all his business and the media. Just then, the doorbell rang, making them both freeze. Victoria looked through the peephole and saw two men in fancy suits standing at the door. We're from Stone Enterprises. Mr. Stone would like to speak with you. Victoria looked at Ethan, who was standing in the hallway. Go to your room and lock the door, she said. Don't come out until I tell you. Mom, I'm not a kid anymore. I want to meet him, Ethan said. Ethan, please. You don't understand what Jonathan is capable of, Victoria begged, but Ethan was already walking to the door. Before Victoria could stop him, he opened it. The lawyers looked surprised when they saw him, a teenage version of their boss. One of them quickly spoke into his phone. Mr. Stone, we're here. You should come right away. Victoria felt like her world was falling apart. For 14 years, she had kept Ethan away from Jonathan because of his greed for power and control. Victoria had even given up her career and moved to a small city to stay hidden. But now, looking at Ethan's sad and confused face, she wondered if she had made a big mistake. 20 minutes later, a black Bentley pulled up outside their building. Victoria watched from the window as Jonathan got out, fixing his tie, something she had seen him do 1,000 times during their marriage. She knew this was the moment that would change everything. The knock on the door felt loud, like the sound of a judge hitting their hammer. Ethan reached for the door, but Victoria grabbed his arm. Whatever happens, she said, looking into her son's eyes, remember that everything I did for you. Then she opened the door, and there he was. Jonathan, the man she had never stopped loving but had always feared. He stood in the doorway in his expensive suit, looking out of place in the small apartment. He looked at Victoria, then at Ethan. Hello, Victoria, he said quietly. I'm Jonathan Stone. I think we have a lot to talk about. Ethan stepped forward. Why didn't you ever look for us? He asked. I didn't know about you, Jonathan said, his voice full of emotion. Your mother made sure of that. Victoria moved between them. You can't just barge in here with your lawyers and take over, she said. This isn't one of your business takeovers. Jonathan laughed bitterly. You kept my son from me for 14 years, and now you're worried about me taking over? He turned to the lawyers. Wait outside. Once the lawyers were gone, the room was filled with tension. Ethan broke the silence. Did you really work 20-hour days? He asked. Jonathan's face softened. I was building something. Something I thought would give us a better life, he said. He looked at Victoria. I never understood why you couldn't wait just a little longer. Victoria's voice cracked. I waited 2 years, Jonathan. 2 years of eating dinner alone. 2 years of going to family events alone. 2 years of trying to reach a husband who was always working. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew nothing would change. You just acquired Pal Tech. Remember, you slept in your office for a month. Ethan watched his parents argue, seeing his own face in both of them. You just left without even trying to work things out, Victoria said, her voice full of anger. I tried, Victoria exploded. I begged him to spend more time with us, but Jonathan Stone doesn't compromise. It's all or nothing with him. It always has been. Jonathan stepped closer to Ethan. That was 15 years ago. I'm different now. I've built my empire, and now I want to know my son. You can't buy 14 years with money, Victoria warned him. No, but I can make the next 14 count, Jonathan replied coldly. He pulled out his phone. Ethan, how would you like to see what your future could look like? I'm having my helicopter pick us up in an hour. I want to show you Stone Enterprises. Ethan's eyes lit up, but Victoria grabbed his arm. He's not going anywhere with you. We don't have a custody agreement, Jonathan said with a cold smile. Actually, my lawyers filed the paperwork while I was driving here. I'm seeking joint custody. Victoria felt dizzy. You can't do this. I can, and I will, Jonathan replied, his voice sharp as steel. You had him for 14 years. Did you really think you could keep him from me forever? Ethan pulled away from his mother. I want to go. I want to see everything. Ethan, please, Victoria begged. You don't know him like I do. Maybe that's the problem, Ethan said. You never gave me the chance to know him at all. His words hurt Victoria deeply. She watched helplessly as Jonathan placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder in a way that seemed so natural, so loving. Pack a bag, Jonathan told Ethan. The helicopter will take us to my penthouse. You can stay in one of the guest rooms tonight. He's not staying anywhere, Victoria protested. The hearing isn't until tomorrow, Jonathan said. Come on, Ethan, let's go. Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. I'm going, Mom. I need to know who I am and where I come from. As Ethan went to his room to pack, Jonathan turned to Victoria. I'll have my driver pick you up for the hearing tomorrow at 9. Wear something appropriate. The media will be there. Victoria felt sick. You called the press? I didn't have to, Jonathan said with a smirk. Someone at the funeral already leaked the story. Millionaire discovers secret son at board member's funeral. It's trending on social media. Victoria sank onto the couch, holding her head in her hands. Everything she had worked so hard for, everything she had built to protect Ethan, was falling apart. Jonathan watched her with a mixture of anger and something that looked like regret. You should have told me, he said softly. Victoria, he's magnificent. Everything I would have wanted in a son. And you stole all those years from both of us. Before Victoria could respond, Ethan came back with a backpack, looking suddenly unsure. Ready? Jonathan asked, his voice soft with his son, but hard as he looked at Victoria. The helicopter's waiting. As they walked out, Ethan turned back. Mom, will you be okay? Victoria forced a smile. I'll see you tomorrow at the hearing, baby. When the door closed behind them, Victoria finally let herself cry. She cried for the young woman who had run away from Jonathan's cold, business-focused world. She cried for the son who looked at his father with hope in his eyes. But mostly she cried because seeing Jonathan again brought back feelings she thought were long gone. The next morning, at the top of the tallest building in the city, Jonathan showed Ethan the view. The lights of the city sparkled below them. Welcome to your heritage, Jonathan said proudly. Stone Enterprises owns most of these buildings. Inside Jonathan's penthouse, Ethan couldn't stop staring. The place was huge, much bigger than their apartment. There was a new laptop on the desk and a closet filled with designer clothes that fit him perfectly. How did you? Ethan started to ask. I had my staff call the best stores in the city, Jonathan said. I gave them your measurements. I always noticed details. That's how I built all this. Ethan touched a designer jacket. Mom always buys my clothes from discount stores. That's going to change, Jonathan said. No son of mine will wear discount clothes. They spent the next hour touring the penthouse while Jonathan talked about building his empire. Ethan hung on every word, seeing himself in his father's actions and way of speaking. But then Jonathan's assistant interrupted. The press is downstairs waiting for a statement. What do you say? Jonathan asked. Ready to meet the world? Ethan hesitated. Shouldn't we wait for Mom? Your mother kept you hidden for 14 years, Jonathan said firmly. Now it's time for you to step into the light and take your rightful place. Downstairs, cameras flashed as Jonathan and Ethan entered the lobby. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Stone, how does it feel to discover you have a son? One asked. Ethan, did you know your father was Jonathan Stone? Jonathan Stone raised his hand, and everyone in the room got quiet. He said, Ladies and gentlemen, today I found something more important than any business deal I've ever made. I found out I have a son. Ethan is my son, and he will be part of the Stone family and Stone Enterprises. More people started asking questions, but Jonathan took Ethan back to the elevator. That's enough for now. Tomorrow after the hearing, we'll do a real press conference, Jonathan said. Ethan's phone started buzzing with messages. His friends had seen him on the news, and his social media followers grew from a few hundred to thousands in just a few hours. I had your phone plan changed to unlimited everything, Jonathan said, and we added special security to keep you safe. Ethan looked at his phone and said, Mom is going to be mad about the press conference. Jonathan replied, Your mom needs to understand that things are different now. You won't go back to that small apartment or public school. You're my son. You deserve the best. Jonathan paused and then added, I've already had my lawyers make an offer. Your mom can have a new house, a car, anything she wants, but you'll live with me. I'll teach you everything about business. You'll go to Riverside Prep. By the time you're ready for college, you'll be ready to take over my company. Ethan felt overwhelmed. Just this morning, he was a regular kid living with his mom in a small apartment. Now, he was in a big penthouse with his rich father who wanted to give him everything. What if I want to spend time with both of you? Ethan asked. Jonathan's face changed. Your mom lied to both of us for 14 years. She kept me from watching you grow up, but I'm not going to make the same mistake. I won't keep you from her. She can visit whenever she wants. A butler brought dinner on shiny silver plates, and they ate. Jonathan told stories about how he built his big business and how one day Ethan would run it. That night, Ethan lay in his new big bed and texted his mom, Mom, are you okay? Victoria replied right away, I love you, baby. We'll figure this out tomorrow. Get some sleep. But Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his mom alone in their old apartment and his dad who wanted to give him everything. 2 different lives, 2 different worlds. How could he choose? Meanwhile, Jonathan was on the phone with his lawyers. I don't care what it takes. I want full custody. She kept him from me for 14 years. She doesn't get to decide his life anymore. He paused and said, Find her secrets. Do whatever you need to. I want my son, and I always get what I want. The next day, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Victoria arrived in a car Jonathan had sent. She wore a borrowed suit that felt strange. Cameras flashed as she walked up the steps. Inside, Ethan was already sitting with Jonathan, both wearing fancy suits. Victoria saw that Ethan looked different, older, and more polished. Just one night in Jonathan's world had already changed him. Ethan smiled for the first time that day. Meanwhile, Victoria started her new job at Jonathan's company. He had given her a position in the legal department, saying they needed her skills. But the other employees treated her differently. Some were polite because she was Jonathan's ex-wife, while others whispered rumors. Victoria's assistant entered her office. Mr. Stone would like to see you in his office. The elevator ride to the top floor felt long. Victoria straightened her skirt, wondering what Jonathan wanted. When she walked in, he was staring out the window. "Our son made a new friend today," Jonathan said, still looking outside. "He's a scholarship student, just like you were in law school." Victoria smiled, remembering. "That's how we met. I was the scholarship girl, and you were the rich kid trying to prove himself." Jonathan turned to face her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you told me about the baby?" "Every day," Victoria admitted. "But back then, you only cared about work, making deals, and buying companies." "I would have loved him," Jonathan said quietly, "just like I loved you." The air between them felt heavy, filled with old feelings and unspoken words. "Mr. Stone," his assistant's voice interrupted, "the board is waiting." That evening, Ethan was doing his homework when the doorbell rang. It was Lillian Chen, his friend. She looked nervous. "Sorry to just show up," she said, handing him a newspaper. "You should see this." Ethan's stomach dropped as he read the headline. "Stone Enterprises Board questions nepotism. Ex-wife's new job raises eyebrows." "They're saying your mom only got the job because of you," Lillian said softly. "The kids at school are talking about it." Ethan ran upstairs and grabbed his phone. He called his father. "Dad, have you seen the newspaper?" "I'm handling it," Jonathan said firmly. "No one questions my decisions or your mother's abilities." But the damage was done. The next day at school, Ethan heard the whispers. "Gold digger. Opportunist." The words followed him in the halls. At lunch, he sat with Lillian. "Why aren't you listening to the rumors?" he asked. Lillian smiled. "Because I see how your mom looks at you when she picks you up. That's not someone after money. That's just a mom who loves her kid." After school, Ethan went to his dad's office. His parents were already there, arguing. "I'm quitting," Victoria said. "I won't have people thinking I used our son to get ahead." "No one tells me how to run my company," Jonathan said, "or my family." "Stop," Ethan shouted. His parents turned to him, surprised. "Mom, you can't quit. And Dad, you can't force people to accept us. We have to prove them wrong." Jonathan and Victoria looked at their son, seeing a little of themselves in his determined face. "When did you get so wise?" Victoria asked softly. "He gets it from both of us," Jonathan said. "The heart and the strength." That night, as Ethan did his homework, he saw his parents talking quietly on the balcony. Their shadows moved closer. Maybe, he thought, broken things could be fixed, not the same as before, but in a new way. His phone buzzed. A text from Lillian. "Survived another day as the scholarship outcasts." Ethan smiled and typed back, "Only works if we stick together." In his office, Jonathan Stone made calls, reminding people who really had power in this city. At home, Victoria worked on her legal plan to prove she belonged at the company. And somewhere between their two worlds, their son was learning that family, like life, was about finding the right balance between love and strength. The next morning at Stone Enterprises, the board meeting was tense. Victoria sat straight in her chair, presenting her first big project. Jonathan watched her from the head of the table, his face unreadable. "As you can see," Victoria finished, "this plan helps the company grow while following the law." The board members whispered among themselves. Finally, the oldest member, Mr. Reynolds, spoke. "Impressive work, Miss Watson. Maybe we judged too soon." Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. He knew Victoria would prove herself. She always did. After the meeting, Victoria gathered her papers. Her hands shook slightly. Jonathan touched her arm. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said softly, "to celebrate." Victoria started to say no, but stopped when she saw his eyes. "Just dinner?" Just dinner. That evening, Ethan was at Lillian's house, working on a school project. "Your parents are having dinner together?" Lillian asked, surprised. Ethan nodded. "Dad's driver picked Mom up an hour ago." "Careful," Lillian warned. "Getting your hopes up about parents getting back together can lead to disappointment." "Speaking from experience?" Lillian looked away. My dad left when my mom was pregnant. Some men can't handle responsibility. My dad's not like that, Ethan said. He just never knew about me. And now he's making up for it by throwing money around? Lillian asked. Then she sighed. Sorry, that wasn't fair. At a fancy restaurant, Jonathan and Victoria sat in a private booth. As they talked, it felt like old times. Remember our first date? Jonathan asked. Victoria laughed. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu because I didn't want to be impressed by your money. And now? Now I know there's more to you than your bank account. Jonathan reached for her hand. Having a son changes you, finding out what I missed, who I missed. Just then, his phone buzzed. His face darkened. Someone is leaking our business plans. You think it's me? Victoria asked. No, Jonathan said quickly. But the board might. We need to find out who it is. Back at Lillian's house, Ethan was washing dishes when his phone buzzed. A news alert. Stone Enterprises merger plans leaked. Ex-wife under suspicion. Mom, he called. I'm fine, baby, Victoria said. Your father knows I didn't do it. But who did? In his office, Jonathan checked security cameras. Mr. Reynolds was caught sneaking files out late at night. Got you, Jonathan muttered. The next day, the news read, Board member arrested for corporate espionage. Victoria's name was cleared. They'll always suspect me first, she told Jonathan, because of our past. Then let's change the story, Jonathan said. He got down on one knee. Marry me again. Victoria stared. Jonathan, I'm not the same man from 15 years ago. You're not the same woman, but maybe we can be better, together. Ethan and Lillian rushed in. Mom, Dad, what's going on? Ethan asked. Lillian pulled his arm. We should go. No, Victoria said. Stay. This is about all of us. Jonathan held up the ring. I'm asking your mother for another chance. Ethan's face filled with hope and fear. Mom, Victoria took a deep breath. Last time, your proposal was like a business deal. This time, it's just about us, about family. Lillian squeezed Ethan's hand as they watched Victoria smile. Yes, she whispered. But this time, we do it right. Family first. Jonathan slipped the ring on her finger. Ethan hugged them both. Lillian tried to step away, but Ethan pulled her in. You're part of this too, he told her. You help me understand what family means. Jonathan looked around the room. His son Ethan, his wife-to-be Victoria, and Lillian, who had become like family, were all there. He suddenly realized something important. Some things in life couldn't be bought with money. Some things had to be built with love, time, and trust. The news of Jonathan and Victoria's engagement spread quickly. Business magazines called it the reunion of the year. The city's newspapers talked about the wedding. But inside Jonathan's big apartment, things were not so simple. We should have a spring wedding, Jonathan said, looking at plans with his event planner. No, Victoria said. Ethan needs time to get used to this. We all do. Ethan was doing his homework nearby, pretending not to listen. But he gripped his pencil tighter every time they mentioned the wedding. That night, Lillian came over for dinner. She found Ethan standing on the balcony, looking at the city lights. Are you scared they'll mess it up again? Lillian asked, standing next to him. I'm scared I'll mess it up, Ethan admitted. What if they're only getting married again because of me? Inside, Jonathan and Victoria were also unsure. They had started talking about legal papers instead of wedding plans. Your lawyers want me to sign a paper that says I won't get any part of the company, Victoria said, feeling hurt. It's just normal business, Jonathan explained. The company's board wants it. Is it the board, or is it you? Victoria asked, standing up. Maybe we're making a mistake. Maybe too much has changed. Just then, the elevator door opened and Anna Chen walked in. She was the lady Jonathan had hired to clean his apartment. He had also helped her family move to a better home. Lillian now went to a good school because of a scholarship Jonathan had given her. Mrs. Chen, Jonathan greeted her. How are you liking your new home? Anna smiled but sighed. It's very nice, but some neighbors say we don't belong. Jonathan's face became serious. He knew those whispers. People had once said the same things about Victoria at work and about Ethan at school. Money can't buy respect, Victoria said softly. We all learned that. That weekend, Jonathan took Ethan to his office to show him the company he would one day own. But in the elevator, they heard two men talking. First, the ex-wife, now the cleaner's daughter. Jonathan is getting soft, one man said. Ethan clenched his fists, but Jonathan put a hand on his shoulder. Let them talk, he said. Real power isn't about what people say behind your back. It's about what you do to make things right. That night, Ethan found his mother sitting at her desk, looking at legal papers. Mom, do you really want to marry Dad again? He asked. Victoria put her papers down. I love him. I always have, but love isn't always enough. Then what is? Ethan asked. Understanding. Compromise, she said. Things your father and I are still learning. The next day, Jonathan called a big meeting with the company's board. Victoria sat beside him. Ethan and Lillian sat in the back, watching. I'm making changes, Jonathan said. First, Victoria will be the company's chief legal officer. Second, we are starting a foundation to help employees and their families. The board members complained, but Jonathan raised his hand. I built this company by seeing value in people. If anyone has a problem with that, they can leave. No one moved. After the meeting, Ethan hugged his father. That was amazing. I learned it from you, Jonathan said. You and Lillian showed me that real wealth isn't about money. That evening, Jonathan, Victoria, Ethan, and the Chens had dinner together. No fancy meals, no servants, just family. I've been thinking, Victoria said, maybe we should have the wedding here, small and simple, just the people who really matter. Jonathan looked at everyone at the table. Perfect, he said. This time it's about what's real. Ethan watched his parents. They weren't just a businessman and a lawyer. They were a man and a woman trying to do things right this time. Lillian nudged him. Still scared about messing things up? She asked. Ethan smiled. No, I think we're all learning together. The morning of the wedding came. The penthouse was decorated with white flowers and soft lights. No fancy decorations, just love. Ethan fixed his tie in the mirror. Lillian walked in wearing a light blue dress. Your grandmother is here, she said softly. Ethan froze. His grandmother, Margaret Watson, had refused to visit before. She didn't want Victoria to marry Jonathan again. In her room, Victoria stood in front of her mother. You're making a mistake, Margaret said. Mom, he's changed, Victoria replied. We both have. Money doesn't change people, Margaret said. It just shows who they really are. Outside the room, Ethan heard the argument. Jonathan found him. Do you want me to ask her to leave? Ethan shook his head. No. Family is messy sometimes. That's what you and Mom taught me. Inside, Margaret sighed. I watched you struggle as a single mother. I watched you work 2 jobs to take care of Ethan, and now you're just going to forget that? I'm not forgetting, Victoria said. I'm forgiving. Ethan stepped into the room. Margaret turned and looked at him. You look just like your father, she said, not in a nice way. I'm proud of that, Ethan said. And I'm proud of Mom. She taught me that people can change, that love is about second chances. Margaret's face softened. You sound like your mother, she said. I'm proud of that too. Jonathan appeared at the door. It's almost time. Mrs. Watson, would you like to help Victoria with her dress? Margaret hesitated. Then she nodded. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Ethan stood between his parents as they exchanged vows. Lillian and her mother sat in the front row. They weren't just workers anymore. They were family. 15 years ago, Jonathan said, I thought success meant making more money. Then I lost the things that really mattered. But life gave me a second chance through our son, through love, through learning what real wealth means. Victoria squeezed Ethan's hand as she spoke. We're not the same people we were before. We're better, because we learned that family isn't about being perfect, it's about being together, no matter what. At the reception, Margaret watched Victoria and Jonathan dance. Lillian's mother ate alongside Jonathan's business partners. No one cared about titles or status anymore. A reporter watched. This is different from the fancy weddings I usually see. That's the point, Ethan said. Real life isn't about appearances, it's about truth. Later, Jonathan found Victoria on the balcony, looking at the city lights. Having second thoughts? He asked. No, she said, just remembering the scared young woman who ran away 15 years ago. She was braver than I was, Jonathan admitted. She chose love over money. I had to learn that lesson the hard way. Ethan and Lillian ran up with cake. Mom's crying again! Lillian wiped happy tears from her eyes. Anna Chen smiled as she followed the family outside. For both my children, she said with love. Catherine walked in, holding bottles of champagne for the grown-ups and sparkling juice for the kids. To family, she cheered, surprising everyone, in all its forms. Everyone lifted their glasses as the sun slowly set over the city. In that golden light, they were not just a CEO, a lawyer, a housekeeper, and their kids. They were simply a family, brought together by fate, choices, and love. What happens now? Ethan asked curiously. Now, Jonathan said with a smile, we build something even better than a big company. We build a family that lasts. Victoria leaned against her husband, who was once her husband before and now was again. She watched their son laugh with his best friend. She saw her mother smiling at last. She felt the warm hug of love and acceptance around her. We already have, she whispered. We already have. A whole year had passed since the wedding. The Stone family's big home was full of laughter as everyone came together to celebrate Ethan's 15th birthday. Make a wish, Victoria said as Ethan stood in front of his birthday cake, glowing with 15 flickering candles. Ethan looked around at his family, then blew out the candles. His father, who used to be a serious businessman, held up his phone, recording everything with a proud smile. His grandmother, Catherine, sat next to Anna Chen, both happily showing pictures of their grandchildren. Lillian, who was now officially Ethan's sister after Jonathan and Victoria adopted her 6 months ago, sneaked a fingerful of frosting from the cake. Everyone laughed. The past year had changed their lives in ways no one had expected. Stone Enterprises was now famous not just for its success, but for helping the community. The company's scholarship program had grown, helping many families like the Chens. Speech, Jonathan called out after Ethan blew out the candles. Ethan stood up, looking taller and more confident than before. A year ago, I was just a kid living in a small apartment, wondering about a dad I had never met, he said. Now I have 2 homes, 2 sisters. He smiled at Lillian and her new baby sister, whom their parents had recently adopted, and more family than I ever dreamed of. Victoria squeezed Jonathan's hand, remembering their long journey to this moment. After many challenges, the company board finally accepted her as the chief legal officer. She had even saved the company from a bad takeover attempt. Jonathan had learned to come home earlier from work because he never wanted to miss another family moment. I have an announcement, Jonathan said after everyone had eaten their cake. I'm stepping back from running Stone Enterprises every single day. The room went quiet. Don't worry, he laughed. I'm not retiring. I'm just making room for what really matters. He looked at Victoria. We're starting a new part of the company, one that focuses only on helping the community and schools. Victoria will run it. Catherine raised her glass. I used to think you were just another tough businessman. I was, Jonathan admitted, until one funeral changed everything. It showed me what I had lost and what I could still have. Ethan found Lillian in their favorite spot on the balcony. Remember when you told me not to get my hopes up about parents getting back together? He asked. Lillian smiled. I was wrong. Sometimes dreams do come true. Not dreams, Ethan said, just real people learning how to love better. Inside, Anna tried to help clean up, but Victoria gently stopped her. "Today, you're family, not staff," she insisted. "Besides, Jonathan loves washing dishes now." "I heard that," Jonathan called from the kitchen, making everyone laugh. And as the night sky darkened over the city, the family gathered in the living room. Ethan opened his presents. His grandmother gave him books. Lillian gave him art supplies. His parents gave him a new laptop. But the best gift came in a small envelope. "What's this?" Ethan asked, opening it. "Ownership shares in Stone Enterprises," Jonathan explained. "But not just for you. Lillian, too. Equal shares." Lillian's eyes widened. "But I'm not." "You are my daughter now," Jonathan said firmly. "On paper and in my heart." Anna started to cry, and Catherine handed her a tissue, patting her hand kindly. Victoria looked at her growing family, her son and his sister, her mother and Anna, and her husband, who had finally learned that love was more important than business. The view from the penthouse was still beautiful, but the real beauty was right here in this room, filled with love and second chances. "One more surprise," Jonathan announced. "I bought back our old house, the one where Victoria and I first lived when we got married. We're turning it into a center for families in need." Ethan hugged his father, feeling the strength of the family that now wrapped around him, not just as a business, but as something much deeper. As the party slowly ended, everyone moved back to the balcony. The city stretched out below them, sparkling with lights, but their attention was on each other. Catherine and Anna swapped recipes. Lillian showed Ethan her college application essays. Victoria and Jonathan held hands, watching their children. "Did you ever think this would happen?" Victoria asked softly. "That day at the funeral?" Jonathan shook his head. "I thought I was just finding out I had a son. Instead, I found out what it really means to be rich." Ethan looked up at his father. "Do you regret anything from the past?" "Only the time I lost," Jonathan said. "But that's the thing about time. You can't get it back. You can only make the most of what's ahead." The night air was cool, but no one wanted to go inside. This moment was too perfect, too precious. They were a family, not because of rules or blood alone, but because they had chosen each other, because they had learned to forgive, because they had learned to love. "To the future," Jonathan raised his glass. "To family," Victoria added. "To love," Ethan and Lillian said together. And as they stood there under the twinkling stars, they knew one thing for sure: some riches can't be counted in money. Some success can't be seen on a business report. And some love stories are worth waiting 15 years to complete. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.